being highly involved in everything all the time. You know, that's actually, I think that's called mania in the psychiatric diagnosis. But what we want actually is to get a sustainable balance that works. And the closest that I've come to yet to find that is this other diagram on the bottom of that blue sheet handout, which actually comes from the commercial world. So it's someone talking about commercial boards. So there's no translation. You have to do the translation into non-profitees and community speak. But essentially, what they're talking about is what the book is called, which is what the article is called, which is when to take charge, when to partner, and when to stay out of the way. So it's actually saying there are times when it's useful for the board to not be involved. There are times where it's useful for the board to actually take over and be the lead, unambiguously, consult with others, but it's the board's responsibility. There are other times when you do need to co-create together, that it is a partnership of doing things together with staff and volunteers. And they have 4 quadrants, and the 4th one is where you're not involved, but it is important that you monitor it, to keep an eye on it, because you have to keep in touch by knowing what's going on, even if you're not directly involved so much. So they talk about those 4 possibilities for just about every task that might be needed to govern and manage an organisation. In some of them, the board needs to unequivocally take the lead. In others, they need to partner with the manager, staff and volunteers. In others, they need to just monitor what the staff and volunteers are doing. And in others, they just should get out of the way altogether and stop distracting or annoying by doing something they don't need to. They're not adding any value in. And that might also then be a way of thinking about, what's the work we don't need to do, because a lot of these governance models are always good at telling you extra jobs you have to do, but there is a limit to my extra. In fact, someone has already accused me more than once in my life of having one too many good ideas, and you can't just keep doing more and more and more. We're not infinitely expandable. So we have to work out what we don't do as much as what we do. So what I'd like you to do is to have another bit of discussion with the people you were talking to a minute ago, and see whether this is a more useful way of thinking about it. So rather than too involved overall or not involved enough overall, to thinking that there are some things we should be highly involved in, some things we should be partnering, some things we should be monitoring, some things we should just get out of the way. So have a look at that. So the examples they gave here are all from commercial organisations, some of which may or may not apply. You'll need to think of what applies. And from my experience, it's quite different from the small grassroots organisations to a big non-profit. So there'll be even a lot of differences within the non-profit sector. But have a look at it yourself and try it on for size, see whether it might help or not help as a way of thinking about getting the balance right. We'll chat with the people you returned to a moment ago.
It makes sense that some things you should be involved in, other things you should you're right.
And not all issues are equal either.
It's also
Well, the manager should have some rules on it, otherwise they're not going to be engaged, they're not going to deliver. When a board decides what they're doing, a surefire way to reach.
Last time I wonder why you said
Yeah, you didn't submit for judging in time. Written over the same thing 5 or 6 times, coloured and stuff.
We're really lucky with too much discussion about the future of
if it comes up,
so you might say something like
I haven't had any conversation with about one of the things I want to do is setting up the position he's the guru of all things around those. One of the things that we'd like to do, and we may have already floated, being able to work made available for starting point, which is the individual organisations got the capital to put it in commercial risk, but as the customer was saying, right, you're not just making that's what we do. Particularly if those things like the commercial library and get kids to create their musical chairs and other buildings and different things. What could be done, what say necessary, what and say the speaker and the old library, but shuffles around. That's a possibility, but that's not going flying because that's a good first yeah, well, why not? Well, but if you're going to play, let's get them to draw that.
It's a true community centre, isn't it? It's all this thing.
That might be a way to get to the reform. Notice there's not a benefit project. Only if you get paid away as a board. I'm more of a friend of the it's okay. Amazing how much it's changed sort of from when I was at school, if you were Googling or not paying attention, by the time it's all get it done.
So accounting teachers is pretty
I know, it's just so
But then they suddenly became
Okay.
A lot of the time
Did people find that a model that they could use
Yeah.
in organisations? Few people? Yep. Okay. So I just want to divert for a moment about the different models of governance, because most of the different models of governance are based on different people's answers to this question of how do we get the balance right between governance and management, operations and board. The interesting thing, if you study this field, and for quite a few years I was lecturing in a graduate program in not-for-profit management, and I had responsibility for the governance course. So I had to look at what literature actually said. And so I tried to find a range of books on that compared different governance models. Now I must admit I did restrict myself to the English language because it's the only one I can read well enough to make sense of academic books. But in all of my searching with the aid of Google Scholar and all the other devices that you can get these days, in the whole of the English language, I found 3 pages in one book, which talked about different models. I found 1 book review which compared 3 different books that all had a different model. And I found 1 article come blog on the internet that talked about different models. Everything else assumed there was only one model, their model, and that was good governance, and everything else was bad. Now I'm familiar with that approach, I take it myself sometimes, but I was stunning to see that so widely misrepresented that people could not, even though when they were talking about completely different models, each one described theirs as the only model. And one in particular actually uses those words. It's the only comprehensive model that's ever been developed for non-profit governance. And on that same website that he describes it and sells you the t-shirt and the hat, the author of that model also says that you have to take his whole model and nothing but the model. You can't just apply bits of it that you like either, so you can't do this bits and pieces. Anyway, so there's a whole lot of people who think there's only one model, but there are a whole lot of different models that people think there's only one model. That particularly annoying one that I just mentioned was developed by John Carver in 1990. So he's one of the more recent ones. A lot of them were developed earlier than that. And he said he was the first because he was the last. But anyway, he also committed the sin of being American. And I have a Canadian colleague. And you might know that Canada's relationship with the US is a bit like New Zealand's relationship with Australia. You know, it's okay to beat them in sport, but you don't actually want them over here. My Canadian colleague was a bit annoyed at John Carver suggesting that he had the one and only true model and he was exporting it to Canada to teach the natives how to do things properly. Because obviously he hadn't been doing it properly before. So he wanted, so my Canadian colleague wanted to do some research to prove that other models were more effective and better governance results than the Carver policy governance model. So I won't go into what the different models were because we actually don't even need to know that for the sake of this story. But basically he set up this North American battling governance models research. That's Transformers. If none of you have children of a certain age, you might not recognise them. He didn't introduce the Transformer image. That's because one of my sons is a great Transformer fan. But what he did was he identified 2 kind of rough indicators of effective governance, an internal measure and an external measure, which again I won't go into now, but they looked reasonable. These things are quite difficult to measure anyway, but they look like reasonable indicators. And he sent out questionnaires to people who had done the Carver policy governance workshops or bought their books or material and had adopted their model. And he also sent out the same questionnaires to people who had done workshops or resources that basically use what's sometimes called the Westminster model, which is an older, been around longer, governance model based on the kind of parliamentary system of separation of powers. And he waited for the results to come back in. Unfortunately, the results for the Carver policy governance followers came in first, and they were medium to high on both the internal and the external score, so that meant they were pretty high overall, which was not the result that he wanted. But being a faithful researcher, he still did throw out the results as they came in, he kept them and added them up. Then the Westminster model followers' results came in, and also he found almost exactly the same result. A range, but from medium to high on both the internal and the external measure, and therefore relatively high overall scores. So at this point, he thought he'd wasted his whole time, and maybe the measures were irrelevant and weren't measuring anything anyway. So all the self-doubt that researchers get when the results don't come in as